Today on Historia Gaia.
The Chinese Republic, Revolution and Modern China. In the early 20th century, many people decided the only thing to do was to sweep away the old order. Leading the revolutionaries was Sun Yat-sen (1866–1925). He put forward three principles: nationalism, democracy, and socialism. In 1905 he formed the Revolutionary Alliance of Tongmenghui. Some soldiers in Wuchang with revolutionary ideas formed an organization called the Literary Society. In 1911 they were planning a revolution. However, they accidentally set off a bomb. Realizing the government would now be alerted, they decided to start the revolution immediately. The revolution soon gathered pace and spread across southern China. Province after province seceded from the Qing Empire. However, the king turned to a man named General Yuan Shikai. This man had been a regional governor, but the king dismissed him, as they feared he was growing too powerful. Now they recalled him and gave him wide powers to crush the revolution. However, when his forces were repulsed at Nanjing, the general decided to change sides. He made a deal with the revolutionaries. He would make China a republic if he could be president. Sun Yat-sen and the other revolutionaries feared that divided China would be easy prey for the foreign powers, so they agreed to his terms. The king were persuaded to abdicate in February 1912. Yuan Shikai became president of China. A parliament was elected in February. The largest party was the nationalists of Kuomintang, with Sun Yat-sen at their head. However, the general had no intention of sharing power with parliament and soon made himself dictator. The Kuomintang was banned at the end of 1913 and parliament was closed in January 1914.
The Warlord Years. When General Yuan died in 1916, China descended into semi-anarchy. The central government had little power and warlords controlled the provinces. In 1916 the Japanese took over the German sphere of influence in Shandong. After the war, in 1919, it became clear that the victorious powers intended to let Japan keep it. This news provoked 3,000 students to demonstrate in Beijing on the 4th of May 1919. They burned the Minister of Communications' house. Although the police moved to suppress the demonstration in Beijing, similar protests took place elsewhere in China. The protest gave rise to a movement called the 4th of May movement, which rejected Confucian values and sought to modernize China. Although the Kuomintang were banned in 1913, they simply moved their base to Guangzhou and continued to operate. In 1921 the Chinese Communist Party, or CCP, was founded. One of the founders of the Communist Party was Mao Tse-tung, 1893–1976. By 1935 he became head of the new party. At first, the Communists decided to cooperate with the Kuomintang. For a time the two joined forces. Meanwhile, China was changing in the early 20th century. Chinese industry was expanding rapidly, although the country remained overwhelmingly agricultural, and China saw a wave of strikes and labor unrest in the 1920s. Then in 1926, the Kuomintang decided to unite China. From their base in the south, they sent an army of 150,000 men into the north. The warlords in some of the northern provinces were defeated, and by the end of 1926 large parts of northern China were brought under Kuomintang control. In 1928 the northern expedition was renewed, and in April Kuomintang forces entered Beijing. China was reunited. Meanwhile, the Kuomintang and the Communists argued. In the autumn of 1927, Mao Tse-tung led a peasant rebellion called the Autumn Harvest Uprising. However, it was crushed. In December 1927 there was an uprising in Guangzhou and a communist government was very briefly established in the city, but government forces soon crushed the movement. In 1930 the Kuomintang said that China was not ready for democracy. Instead, China became a military dictatorship led by Chiang Kai-shek. In 1930 Li Lisan led another communist rebellion, but it was easily crushed. However, in the countryside, Mao Tse-tung adopted a much more successful policy. From his base in a mountain range, he carried out guerrilla warfare. He created a well-disciplined force that conducted hit and run raids and hid whenever the enemy advanced, avoiding pitched battles. His men were able to tower down and demoralize them. Guerrilla warfare proved to be extremely successful in the 20th century. In 1934, the Kuomintang attempted to encircle the communists. Mao decided to break out. About 90,000 soldiers escaped the trap and embarked on a long march to the north of China. This long march became legendary, although less than 20,000 of those who took part survived the march. Then in 1937, communists and Kuomintang agreed to a temporary truce to fight Thin Japanese. In 1931, the Japanese occupied Manchuria. In 1932, they created a separate state with a puppet government called Manchukuo. In 1937, the Japanese invaded the rest of China. The invasion began with the rape of Nanjing, when tens of thousands of people in that city were murdered. Women were raped and buildings were burned. However, the Japanese were unable to conquer all of China due to its sheer size.
In the 1930s, some modernization occurred in the coastal cities of China. Many new railways were built and many more roads were metalled. The amount of electricity generated increased 7 times over. Industrial output was small, but it was growing. Coal mining boomed. Cotton spinning also grew. However, the interior of China remained overwhelmingly agricultural. When the Japanese invaded in 1937, Chiang Kai-shek attempted to evacuate many people, especially skilled workers, to the unoccupied areas of China. Industrial machinery was also evacuated west. However, to finance the fighting, the Kuomintang was forced to print money. The result was rampant inflation, which undermined their support. The revolution in China. In August 1945, Russia declared war on Japan. As a result, Russian troops occupied Manchuria after the Japanese surrender. When they withdrew, the communists were left in control of Manchuria. In 1946, the civil war resumed between communists and Kuomintang. At first, the Kuomintang were successful and they recaptured southern Manchuria and other parts of northern China. However, the communists turned to guerrilla warfare and successfully harassed the Kuomintang and their lines of communication. From the middle of 1947, the communists were winning the war. Then in November 1948, January 1949, the communists won a victory at Huaihai. They encircled an army of 300,000 Kuomintang and eventually forced them to surrender. After that, the Kuomintang position swiftly collapsed. The communists took Beijing in January 1949. In April they took Nanjing and in May Shanghai. The remaining Kuomintang then fled to Taiwan, and in October Mao Tse-tung declared the People's Republic of China in Beijing.
Modern China. The early years of the People's Republic under the communists' industry was nationalized. The peasants were encouraged to pool their resources and form their small farms into cooperatives. Any opposition to the communist regime was ruthlessly suppressed. In 1958, Mao launched an attempt to greatly increase the output of farming and industry. It was called the Great Leap Forward. Agricultural cooperatives were joined together to form larger units called communes. Creches and nurseries were set up so women could work. Communes were encouraged to make steel in their own makeshift furnaces. Many peasants were forced to work on water conservation works. However, the Great Leap Forward proved to be a disaster. Most of the steel was of very poor quality and could not be used. Worse, farm output greatly declined and there was a terrible famine in China in 1959-62. Far too much labor was diverted to making steel or building projects, leaving not enough for the harvests, which in some areas were left to rot. Worse, crops fell prey to locusts. In 1958, Mao launched a campaign to kill sparrows, because they ate grain seeds. However, sparrows also ate locusts and other insects. Huge numbers of sparrows were killed, and without natural predators the number of locusts greatly increased, making the famine worse. Yet even though there was a famine and people were starving, China continued to export grain. An estimated 36 million people in China died in the famine. Not all died of starvation. Starving people were executed for stealing food. It was the worst man-made famine in history. However, Mao was unmoved by the famine. He said, "To distribute resources evenly will only ruin the Great Leap Forward. It is better to let half the people die so that the other half can eat their fill." Nevertheless, the Great Leap Forward was a failure and it had to be abandoned. Afterward, Mao lost some of his authority. The Cultural Revolution in China. In 1966, to reassert his authority, Mao launched the Cultural Revolution. Students began to call themselves the Red Guard and they held rallies in Beijing. Soon a movement began to root out old habits, beliefs, and attitudes and cause a cultural revolution. The Red Guard began to attack intellectuals and also officials. In 1967 they forced the mayor and other officials in Shanghai to resign. The same thing happened in other cities as well. Many party officials were purged and removed from power. During the Cultural Revolution, religion was persecuted in China. Many places of worship were destroyed. Mao, like all Marxists, was an atheist and he detested religion. However, in 1968 Mao realized that things were going too far. The Red Guard was disrupting industry and agriculture. Mao ordered them to disband. Mao himself died in September 1976. In 1989 a mass demonstration was held in Tiananmen Square in Beijing demanding democratic reforms. It was crushed by the Chinese army.
China's economic miracle. In the late 20th century, China introduced a market economy. As a result, China became an amazing success story. The economy grew very rapidly in the last years of the 20th century, and by the mid-1990s China had become an affluent society. Consumer goods like TVs and fridges became common. In the last years of the 20th century, the government switched to a market economy. Peasants in communes were given contracts. They were given a certain amount of land and agreed to grow a certain amount of crops. If they grew any excess, they could sell it. In industry, factories were given more autonomy. They were allowed to make their own agreements with their suppliers and their customers. If they made large profits, they could pay their workers bonuses. The new slogan was, "To be rich is glorious." 4 special economic zones were formed in the east of China. The result was a huge increase in Chinese industrial output and a great improvement in Chinese standards of living. In 2005 there was a significant sign of China's growing economic power when Shanghai overtook Rotterdam as the largest port in the world. China is predicted to become the world's largest economy by 2040. Another sign of development came in 2019 when China landed a spacecraft called Chang'e 4 on the dark side of the moon. In 2020 the population of China was 1.4 billion.